Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question that I think is both simple and profound. Why do we experience happiness?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and not just in a, fluffy, feel-good kind of way. We're going deep into the science and the evolutionary logic behind it.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
We often take happiness for granted, but when you really stop to think about why it exists, it opens up a whole new perspective on human behavior.
Absolutely. To help us unpack this, we've got some excerpts from a scientific paper titled Happiness is a Genetic Incentive System.
Oh, cool.
And I'm really excited to dive into this with you.
Yeah, me too.
It challenges some of those classic economic theories that link happiness directly to wealth or possessions.
Right, like the idea that if you just keep accumulating more and more stuff, you'll eventually just reach, like, peak happiness.
Right, exactly.
But reality seems to paint a very different picture.
Yeah, it's like that old economics lesson with the milk duds. You get a handful, you're thrilled, then another, and another, and pretty soon you're just sick of them.
Yeah.
Diminishing returns, right.
Right.
But that doesn't quite explain our, endless pursuit of things like money.
Exactly. Economically speaking, we should reach a point where more money doesn't equal more happiness.
Right.
Yet we're constantly striving for more, even when it doesn't necessarily translate to greater well-being.
And it's not just anecdotal, right? Research actually shows very little correlation between those objective factors like wealth, age, or even health and long-term happiness.
That's so interesting.
Like there's a deeper reason for happiness.
Yeah.
Something beyond just getting what we want.
There is. Do you remember that anecdote from the paper about the Ugandan man and his incredibly enthusiastic Kurinji?
Oh, yeah.
Despite his circumstances?
That was so powerful.
I know.
Here's a guy who, by many material measures, might be considered poor.
Right.
Yet his expression of joy was so genuine and contagious.
Yeah.
It really challenges that whole assumption that material wealth equals happiness.
It really does. And it hints at the idea that happiness might be tied to something much deeper, something more fundamental to our biology.
Okay, so if it's not just about getting more stuff, then what's the deal with happiness? Why do we even experience it?
Well, to understand that, we need to zoom in and look at the brain itself.
Okay.
Specifically at a neurotransmitter called dopamine.
Wait, dopamine, that's the feel-good chemical, right? The one we hear about with, like, addiction and pleasure.
You got it. Dopamine plays a crucial role in the brain's reward system. Imagine, like, a rush of pure joy flooding your brain.
Okay.
That's dopamine at work. It's like the brain's own internal currency for happiness.
So when we do something pleasurable, like eating a delicious meal or achieving a goal, our brain rewards us with a little dopamine hit.
Precisely. And it gets even more interesting. Our brains are wired to learn through reinforcement.
Okay.
And dopamine is the key player in this process.
You mean like those classic experiments with Pavlov's dogs?
Exactly.
They learn to associate the sound of a bell with food.
Yeah.
So they'd start drooling just at the sound of the bell.
Yeah.
Even if there was no food present.
That's a perfect example. It shows how our brains learn to connect certain cues or actions with rewards.
Right.
And dopamine is that chemical messenger that reinforces those connections. Do something pleasurable, get a dopamine hit, and your brain is more likely to repeat that action in the future.
So it's like our brains are constantly trying to figure out how to get more of those dopamine rewards.
Exactly.
But there's more to it, right? Something about unexpected rewards.
You're catching on quickly. It turns out that dopamine isn't just released for expected rewards. It's actually heightened for unexpected rewards and suppressed for outcomes that are worse than expected.
Hold on. Are you saying that if I expect a reward and I get it, I don't get as much of a dopamine boost?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
It's kind of counterintuitive.
It is. The dopamine system is all about surprises. It thrives on novelty and the unexpected. Remember that concept of reference points we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
It's like we don't judge happiness in a vacuum.
Right.
We're always comparing our current state to something else.
Right. Like, am I better off now than I was last year?
Yeah.
Or do I have more than my neighbor? That comparison point is our reference point, and it's always shifting, right?
Exactly. And that constantly shifting reference point is a key reason why happiness can feel so fleeting.
Okay, this is where it starts to get really mind-blowing for me.
Yeah.
So we've got dopamine as this reward signal, and our brains are wired to chase those rewards, but our reference points for happiness are always changing.
Right.
What's the big picture here?
Well, to understand the why behind all of this, we need to shift our perspective
Okay.
and look at it from an evolutionary standpoint.
Evolutionary. Like survival of the fittest and all that. I didn't realize Darwin had anything to do with happiness.
Oh, he does. Biology doesn't just look at the how of things, but also the why. It's about understanding the ultimate function of a trait like happiness and how it contributed to survival and reproduction over time.
So you're saying there's a deeper evolutionary why behind happiness beyond just feeling good in the moment.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's dive in.
Let's do it. Think of it like bird migration. We know how it works. The shortening days trigger hormonal changes that make birds fly south.
Right.
But the why is even more interesting. It's about survival escaping harsh winters to increase their chances of reproduction.
So you're saying that just like bird migration, there's a deeper evolutionary reason behind happiness.
Yeah.
Something tied to survival and passing on our genes.
Exactly. Dopamine is the how, the immediate mechanism, but the why, the ultimate reason, is all about making sure those genes get passed down through generations.
Okay, genes evolution, this is where my brain starts to go, well, hold on a minute.
Right.
How do genes fit into all of this?
Well, from a biological perspective, we can think of organisms as survival machines built to propagate their genes. It's like we're all vehicles for our genes to replicate and continue on to the next generation.
So are you saying that happiness is just a trick our genes play on us to make sure we survive long enough to reproduce?
It's not so much a trick as a brilliant strategy.
Okay.
Think about it. Why do we get no pleasure from essential functions like breathing or digestion? These things are crucial for survival, but they don't trigger that dopamine rush.
That's a good point. I guess we just take those things for granted.
You're right.
Because they just happen automatically.
Yeah.
But we get a surge of pleasure from eating a sugary treat.
Yeah.
And that's not exactly essential for survival.
Right. Especially not in today's world.
Right.
That's a perfect example of how happiness, or more specifically pleasure, is used by our genes as an incentive.
Okay.
In the past, seeking out sugar-rich foods provided quick energy, which was obviously advantageous for survival. Those who craved sugar were more likely to find it, survive, and pass on those sugar-loving genes.
So our love for sugar is a leftover instinct from our ancestors. Makes sense, but now with sugar everywhere, it's more of a curse than a blessing.
Exactly. It's a classic example of an evolutionary mismatch.
Right.
Our preferences adapted to a past environment that no longer exists.
Right.
But back to the main point. Happiness and the dopamine rush that comes with it is a way for our genes to guide our actions, especially in situations where direct genetic control isn't feasible.
Okay, let me see if I'm following this. Our genes can't directly control complex behaviors.
Right.
Like finding food or choosing a mate. So they use happiness as a kind of carrot on a stick to steer us in the right direction.
You got it. Think of happiness and even unhappiness as feedback mechanisms.
Okay.
They tell us whether we're on the right track towards fulfilling those evolutionary goals, finding food, shelter, a mate, raising offspring.
So it's less about achieving a constant state of bliss and more about our genes constantly nudging us towards survival and reproduction.
Right.
Like, hey, you're feeling good, keep doing what you're doing. Or feeling down, change something.
Precisely. And that's why our reference points are always shifting.
Right.
Our genes benefit from us constantly striving, not from achieving permanent satisfaction.
So it's not about reaching the destination, but the continuous journey.
Exactly. It's like those dog racing tracks that use a mechanical rabbit to keep the dogs motivated.
Wait, what does dog racing have to do with happiness?
Well, just like those dogs are driven by the illusion of catching a rabbit.
Right.
We're driven by the pursuit of happiness.
Okay.
It's the fuel that keeps us running, even if true, lasting happiness always seems just out of reach.
That's a pretty powerful analogy. So if we're always chasing this happiness rabbit, does that mean we're doomed to be forever unsatisfied?
It's not about doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Understanding this genetic incentive system can actually be empowering.
How so?
Well, if we recognize that our desire for happiness is part of our biological programming, we can make more conscious choices about what truly brings us lasting fulfillment. We can question those ingrained desires and figure out what aligns with our values and goals.
So it's about taking control of the happiness rabbit instead of letting it control us.
Exactly. By understanding the game, we can play it smarter. We can focus on things that bring genuine satisfaction, not just fleeting dopamine hits.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener. It's like I've been looking at happiness through the wrong lens this whole time.
And now, with this new understanding, you can approach your own pursuit of happiness with more awareness and intention.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about dopamine, evolutionary pressures, and even dog racing.
Mm-hmm.
But I still have one big question.
Okay, what's that?
If happiness is just a tool for our genes to keep us striving, does that mean it's not real?
That's an excellent question and one that deserves careful consideration. It really gets to the heart of what happiness is and how it shapes our lives. It's a tricky one, for sure. I mean, while happiness serves an evolutionary purpose that doesn't diminish its reality in our lives,
Right?
the feeling itself is real. The joy, the contentment, the connection.
Yeah.
These are all very real experiences. They're produced by those complex biological processes we've been discussing, driven by dopamine and shaped by evolution.
So the feeling itself is real, but the reason it exists might be more about survival than just pure bliss.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction.
Okay.
Our genes provide the framework, the motivation, but the actual experience of happiness is something we create through our interactions with the world.
So even though our genes are pushing us towards certain behaviors, we still have a say in how we experience and interpret those feelings.
Absolutely. We have the power to shape our own happiness. Knowing that our brains are wired to seek out novelty and challenges, we can actively pursue activities that bring us genuine joy and fulfillment.
So instead of chasing those fleeting pleasures, we can focus on building meaningful relationships, pursuing passions, and contributing to something larger than ourselves.
Precisely. By aligning our actions with our values, we can tap into a deeper, more sustainable form of happiness that goes beyond those quick dopamine hits.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
It's like I've been handed a new set of lenses for understanding happiness.
And now, equipped with this new understanding, you can approach your own pursuit of happiness with more awareness and intention.
So to wrap things up, let's recap the key takeaways from our deep dive into the happiness incentive system.
Okay.
Number 1, happiness is a complex biological system designed to motivate us in specific ways that has evolutionary roots.
Right.
Number 2, our reference points for happiness are constantly shifting because our genes benefit from us constantly striving, not achieving permanent satisfaction.
Yes.
And number 3, while happiness serves an evolutionary purpose, the experience of joy and fulfillment is very real.
And perhaps the most important takeaway is this. Understanding how this genetic incentive system works can empower us to make more conscious choices about what truly brings us lasting happiness.
Well said. Once you understand the rules of the game, you can start playing it to your advantage.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe we can even outsmart our genes and find a way to experience genuine, lasting happiness on our own terms.
That's a challenge I'm definitely up for. And for our listeners out there, I encourage you to join us on this journey. Question your desires, explore new perspectives, and discover what truly makes you happy.
It's an ongoing exploration, but one that's definitely worth the effort.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the science of happiness. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey. Until next time, keep those dopamine levels high and those minds curious.